Queenan is the town. We don't yet have casualty reports except 21 wounded, but the whole building collapsed, so the chances are there'll be something more.
Where is Queenan located?
It's up in the
northern part of South Vietnam?
Central part, the northern part of South Vietnam, as I understand it.
And is strictly American?
This particular building was requisitioned for an aircraft maintenance detachment. It was their billet.
And what was it, mortar fire again?
No, it seems to have been a sabotage bomb, but they don't say for sure. They just say an explosion. Bombed is what they say.
Wheeler ought to tell Westmoreland right now to start getting the Vietnamese cranked up. And he ought to tell his people and his carrier people, whoever he needs, to go on and start getting ready.
And the preliminary instructions have already been issued by SINCPAC, and they're on alert. But
all right, let's get them all ready, and let's go if we can today.
Right.
For 2 days and nights, American jets punished the North Vietnamese for the Viet Cong's attacks on Pleiku and Quy Nhon. It also marked a turning point. Johnson was now ready to approve a significant escalation, an open-ended bombing campaign to undermine the communist leadership in Hanoi. The program was codenamed Rolling Thunder. The generals wanted it to last for months, only end following a communist capitulation. Johnson knew that this was a significant escalation, that it would cause problems on Capitol Hill. He needed political allies to join in the fight, men who would give the campaign a veneer of bipartisanship.
Mr. President?
Well, how are you?
Just fine, sir. Let me get the president for you.
Yes?
President Truman on 90.
Hello? Hello?
How you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. How are you?
Oh, I'm having hell.
What's the trouble?
Well, I got a little bit in the Congress, and a little bit with the Indochina, the Vietnamese, and a little bit all over the country, and I just thought I'd call you and try to get a little advice and a little inspiration. And I've been reading history and saw how much hell you had, and you handled it pretty good. And I just thought maybe I could learn something from you.
Well, I think you're handling it pretty good, too.
No. I think when they go in and kill your boys, you got to hit back, and I'm not trying to spread the war, and I'm not trying to...
You bet you have. You bust them in the nose every time you get a chance, and they understand that language better than any other kind.
And I don't want to tax you, but I always want you to know that I need your counsel and I love you.
Well, that's mutual, and I'm glad to give you whatever experience I've had, although you know it as well as I do.
Give Miss Bessemer love.
I'll sure do it.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
LBJ now reached out to former President Dwight Eisenhower. The two men met at the White House on February 17, 1965. We've recreated the Oval Office scene to illustrate that immediately after the meeting, the president called Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen.
Hello. Hi, Everett. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Pretty good.
I wondered whether, after your session with Ike, you had anything that I needed to know.
He was in hearty agreement with what we were doing and what our policy is out there. Let me get his exact language. I took it down. He says that our purpose is to preserve Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
That we know from Munich on that when you give the dictators feed on raw meat, and if they take South Vietnam, they take Thailand, they take Indonesia, they take Burma, come right on back to the Philippines. He says that he would continue doing what we're doing, that he would make it clear that we're going to stay, and the stamina of the American people is equal to this task. And our continuing actions will be measured and fitting and adequate.
The principal difficulty in drawing up plans for the defense of South Vietnam remained the problem of not knowing whether the country had a functioning government. For over a year, the nation had teetered on the verge of anarchy. Now, Saigon was again filled with students demanding that America withdraw. Faced with rioting on the streets, the Saigon government asked for a delay, time to control the mobs. It would be almost 3 weeks before Lyndon Johnson could finally approve the launch of Rolling Thunder.
Give you the final sign-off from his side on Rolling Thunder?
He said we'd go ahead, we could talk it over at 1 tomorrow and cancel it, but they're sending out the order.
Very good. Well, I'll tell Ambassador Taylor then that it's all right for him to talk to the Vietnamese about it.
Yeah.
Very good.
Rolling Thunder began on March the 2nd, 1965. 100 U.S. Air Force planes struck ammunition dumps 10 miles inside North Vietnam. It became the most sustained bombing campaign in the history of warfare.
The raids are designed to cut off supplies from the north to the Viet Cong rebels in the south. The U.S. is relying on its intelligence reports, which estimate that 80 to 90% of the rebel supplies come from North Vietnam and Red China. One after another, the planes take to the air for the red targets. This proved to be one of the most successful of the U.S. air raids. One plane was lost about 60 miles from its carrier on a return flight. Washington says the raids will continue until the Reds realize it is time to talk peace.
Johnson became obsessed by the details of the war. He knew when the planes took off and when they were scheduled to reach their targets.
Until anything at all happens, call me here. Until that situation room. I'll do that. All time of night. I don't give a damn. I want to keep just as close to it as if I was in the situation room.
All right, sir.
Okay. Situation room?
Yes, sir. We have a preliminary report in now. We believe at this time that there are 2 U.S. planes missing. There were 19 Vietnamese planes in this operation. 18 were recovered. 1 was down, of which the pilot was recovered. It's still too early. I don't have a report in yet on the target area, mission accomplished, or just what happened there over the target, but the weather was clear. The United States target was an ammo dump, and the Vietnamese was the shipyard.
It looked like our 2 pilots are lost.
It looks like 2 U.S. pilots lost, and search and rescue is underway for them at this time, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sir, bye.
White House logs show that the president was called 3 more times that night, at 2:53, at 5:10, and finally, after a sleepless night, a report from Cyrus Vance at 8:09 in the morning. It was a routine the president never broke. He told his staff that these were his boys. He had put them in harm's way. He wanted to know that they were safe. It also marked the beginning of a rapid series of events that sealed Johnson's fate. Unanticipated consequences that pulled him deeper into war. Rolling Thunder involved the introduction of long-range bombers that required a fixed airstrip. That led to a decision to use the South Vietnamese base at Da Nang. That in turn forced Johnson to accept General Westmoreland's insistence that the planes needed the protection of the U.S. Marines.
Commanders from the field are in with unanimous recommendations that we move a portion of a Marine Expeditionary Brigade into Da Nang to provide protection there. The buildup of Viet Cong forces in the surrounding area is fairly substantial, and they're fearful that the huge number of aircraft we have in Da Nang and the personnel are subject to attack. This is a recommendation I would be very reluctant to accept, but frankly, I doubt we have any alternative. In effect, the alternative is to risk the loss of the personnel and the planes at Da Nang, or move Marines in. Yes, sir, that's the alternative. The psychological impact of the Marines are coming is going to be a bad one. And I know that every mother is going to say, oh, this is it. Because a Marine is a guy that's got a dagger in his hand, and it's going to put the flag up. Well, we'll just go with it, and we know what we're walking into. And if Rather than have it said, well, we wanted protection for a plane, you wouldn't give it to us. My answer is yes. Okay. But my judgment's no.
There's going to be a lot of headlines on it when it comes out. Just like you're out.
You telling me? Okay.
All right, then.
Johnson had always feared that one day he would be asked to commit ground troops to Vietnam. Less than a week after firing the first salvos of Rolling Thunder, he'd been cornered into making a decision that went against his best political judgment. Even Johnson's ambassador to Saigon, Maxwell Taylor, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned the president that sending in the Marines was a mistake, that America was being dragged into a land war where it would be forced to confront an enemy on the enemy's terms. Johnson understood the risks, but also knew that his congressional critics would hold him responsible if the Viet Cong killed American pilots stationed at an undefended airstrip.
We're going to send the Marines in to protect the battalion at Da Nang. What do you think?
It scares the life out of me, but I don't know how to back up now. It looked to me like we just got in this thing and there's no way out. We're just getting pushed forward and forward and forward.
That's right.
Forward,
that is exactly right. That's right. And we're losing more every day.
That's right.
Dick, the trouble is, a man can fight if he can see daylight down the road somewhere.
Actually,
but there ain't no daylight in Vietnam. There's not a bit.
There's no end of the road. There's just nothing.
The more bombs you drop, the more nations you scare, the more people you make mad, the more embassies you get painted.
It's the worst mess I ever saw in my life. You couldn't have inherited a worse mess.
Well, they'd say I inherited, be lucky, but they'll all say I created after another day. Bye.
2 days after that conversation, 3,500 men of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade came ashore at Da Nang. They arrived in full battle dress to take up positions around the perimeter of the airbase. Trained to hunt out the enemy, they were being ordered to wait for the Viet Cong to attack. It was a defensive deployment that went against the Marines' training and doctrine. But despite the Marines landing, the picture across the South showed continued erosion. At the end of March, the Viet Cong couldn't have been more brazen.
Red Terror tactics in South Vietnam hit at the United States Embassy in Saigon. Minutes after the blast, the cameraman records the scene as rescue workers ignored danger to probe the wreckage for the wounded. Reaction to the outrage was one of dismay and shock in Washington. President Johnson said the attack would only reinforce the administration's determination to give more help to South Vietnam.
This Situation Room?
Yes, sir.
What do you got on our Saigon?
Well, we have some more casualty figures in now. The total of 2 U.S. killed. And
you know who they are? Soldiers, women, or what?
We have women listed so far, 2 women.
Know who they are?
Yes, sir, we do have the names.
Who are they?
First one is Barbara Robin from Denver, Colorado. And the second one, first name is Manolto Castillo.
Both American?
Both American, yes, sir.
How many Vietnamese were killed?
We have a total of 15 Vietnamese killed with approximately 40 injured.
Okay, much obliged.
Yes, sir.
2 days later, on April the 2nd, the President agreed with Westmoreland's request that members of the 173rd Airborne be assigned to undertake what became known as search and destroy missions. It was yet another significant incremental escalation along the road to war. The message was clear. U.S. troops were no longer willing to sit back and simply respond to communist attacks. But despite the green light to his field generals, Johnson was again having second thoughts. 5 days after sending the airborne into battle, he wanted to find a way out. He used a previously scheduled speech to Johns Hopkins University to offer Ho Chi Minh a deal. Abandon your dream of a unified socialist republic, and America will reward you with a vast recovery program to benefit the whole of Southeast Asia.
What do the people of North Vietnam want? What they want, their neighbors also desire. Food for their hunger, health for their bodies, a chance to learn, progress for their country, and an end to to the bondage of material misery.
On the flight back to Washington aboard Marine One, Johnson told his staff that he was prepared to submit a $1 billion aid request to the Congress as soon as the North Vietnamese signed on. He told them he was sure the communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, would not be able to resist. Within 24 hours, Washington had its answer: no deal. The president now told his aide, Bill Moyers, that he felt like a hitchhiker caught in a storm on a Texas highway. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, and he couldn't make it stop. Johnson felt he was running out of options. The Pentagon was increasing its demand for men, and the North was stepping up its campaign. LBJ made one final offer he hoped would tempt Ho Chi Minh to the negotiating table. He privately told the North Vietnamese that he would suspend Rolling Thunder. In return, he wanted some sign that Hanoi intended to withdraw its support for the Viet Cong. For a week, the planes stayed on the carriers. For a week, Johnson waited for a sign, any sign, that the North was willing to back down. For a week, there was silence. The response, when it came, was not from the leadership in Hanoi. It was from the fighters in the field. This is our recreation of the scene at 4:30 in the morning of April 24th, 1965, in the Pentagon's Combat Control Center.
We do have a piece of press which I think you'll be interested in. It involves Viet Cong guerrillas ending a prolonged lull in the fighting in the Mekong Delta yesterday with 2 successful attacks on government troops as little as 8 miles from Saigon. The American military spokesman said the Reds overran a militia outpost 8 miles south of the city, killing or wounding all but 2 of the 33-man garrison. In another clash reported, Communist forces surrounded an 80-man government unit along a river 55 miles south of the capital, and half the government force was killed, missing or wounded before survivors managed to escape. That is about, I think, the highlights that we had last evening, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Every report from the Pentagon told the president the South Vietnamese were incapable of holding the line. Even the 30,000 Americans he had sent were at best a holding action. Johnson told friends that the presidency was the loneliest job in the world. He told McGeorge Bundy that his gut told him the day was fast approaching, when he'd have to make the ultimate decision: get in or get out.
I looked at this sergeant of mine this morning, got 6 little old kids over there, and I just thought about ordering those kids in there, and what in the hell am I ordering him out there for?
One thing that is
what the hell is Vietnam worth to me? What is Laos worth to me? What is it worth to this country?
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you start running the communists, they may just chase you right into your own kitchen.
In Johnson's mind, the issue was far wider than the future of Indochina. He'd always seen the Vietnamese conflict not as a civil war, but rather as a part of a coordinated communist effort. America also faced that threat in Berlin, the Congo, and now, in late April 1965, communism was on the march in America's own backyard.
What began as a revolution by followers of exiled Dominican President Juan Bosch quickly deteriorated into outright anarchy when the leadership was taken over by communist agents. They exhorted civilians to take to the streets, replaced their wooden clubs with rifles, and instituted a reign of terror.
They are moving other places in the hemisphere. It may be a part of a whole communistic pattern tied in with Vietnam. Now, our CIA says this is a completely led, operated, dominated, they've got men on the inside of it, Castro operation. They're firing consistently every hour on our embassy. Now, here's what I think we ought to do. We ought to have our military forces in sufficient quantity, adequate number, appropriately ready to take that island to see that Castro doesn't take it.
Overnight, with the Marines poised for action, the fighting in the Dominican capital of Santo Domingo intensified. Trapped in the middle, 3,000 American citizens faced with the real possibility of being caught up in the escalating violence. Johnson felt the country needed to know what he knew, that it wasn't a regional dispute, but actually a fight against international communism. Only Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was willing to challenge the presidential assertion that this was an international communist conspiracy.
Why don't you think I should say that the powers outside the Republic are trying to gain control? We all know they are. What's wrong with my saying?
Well, I think you've got a pretty tough job to prove that, Mr. President. As president, the rest of us can say things like that, and we don't have to prove it. And I think puts your own status and prestige too much on the line. To say that you as president personally say that of your knowledge that powers outside the hemisphere are trying to subvert this government or subvert those people, I don't think you're in a very strong position to say that.
But the president continued to insist that the Dominican fight was being orchestrated from Havana. On April the 30th, Johnson decided to act. He ordered the Marines aboard the USS Boxer to move into the Dominican Republic. For the commander-in-chief, having sent his boys into battle, there was now nothing he could do but wait into the early hours of the morning for news from the front.
Is this Pentagon Situation Room?
Yes, Mr. President. General Smith is on. This is General Smith, Mr. President.
What do we have this morning from Dominican?
We've just gotten in information from the embassy down there, sir, that we have a total of 20 Marines wounded, 2 dead, and we have 1 Army dead, 1 possible dead, and 16 others wounded. The rebels are planning to make some kind of an assault against the police station and possibly the embassy with some rebel forces armed with machine guns.
Okay, thank you.
On the morning of May 3rd, there was more bad news. The Joint Chiefs wanted 48,000 additional troops, not for the Dominican Republic, but for Vietnam. It would more than double the commitment, but Johnson wanted no debate, no national discussion